system, as well as gravity bringing it back down. So when we look at the lunge pattern, if we did an anterior lunge and I moved the ladder in that same direction, I'm taking a step forward and having to produce an external force going through the body to have to decelerate this ladder. If I move it to the side, same thing. So now my direction of my ladder is changing, but the concept of biomechanics and how this object wants to continue to go in that path will have to go until I create an external force to stop it. Okay. So we can now use the concept, we can change it into more of a transverse plane lunge as well, where I have to lunge, but the ladder is tilting at the same time. So the direction of my force won't change, okay? But the line of stress is going to change as I'm moving and having to decelerate this object. So it becomes really important when you're working with your clients that if we are going to choose a particular activity, is to also think about where do we want that client to move, to what end purpose, and what is happening through the body and what happens in the system when we try to first mitigate stress. Okay? So when we change the vector, we're going to change not only the point of application of that mass, but also the line of stress and what it does to the body. And when we see you in future discussions, we'll talk a little bit more about triangulation and how that relates, again, back to tensegrity and functional anatomy. So when we can truly look at 3 dimensions of movement. And just to touch on it quickly, the 3 dimensions of movement is the direction in which I'm going, so whether it's forward, whether it's to the side, whether it's maybe through rotation, or any combination of that direction is one part of it. The second part is the vertical height. If I reach that ladder down to the ground, it's going to require a lot more force than if I just tipped it with my hand being at chest height. So again, that's going to change the whole thought process of how we take forces, how the body first wants to spread that force out because it's very efficient, very economical, and it wants to do that first. It'll always try to spread that force out before it ever produces it. And the third thing, obviously, is the distance that I'm going. So if we wanted to take that same drill and do an anterior lunge with a horizontal reach or an anterior reach at the same time, I could do an anterior lunge with just an initial range of motion, right? We could do an anterior lunge to end range of motion, but with an initial reach. We could do an anterior lunge to mid-range of motion, so anterior lunge to mid, and then we could obviously do end range of motion with an end range of motion reach. So we got a lot more load and a lot more force that the body has to overcome. So there's one example there. The third one that we kind of wanted to look at is ground reaction. So if I take an object like a medicine ball, and Newton's third law basically states that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. And this becomes important because for us to know is the importance of what the ground does to us. And so in the lunging example, every time we took a step forward, there was, when I planted my foot into the ground, there's a reaction that's supplied by the ground back into my body to allow me to decelerate, lengthen, and spread out that force, and then transfer that force in the opposite direction. If we looked at a medicine ball and just dropping a medicine ball, you would see that it's going to move in the same direction until an external force moves against it. Newton's first law. But what's really important about this is understanding that as soon as this ball hits the ground, there is going to be the same amount of force directed back into that ball. So what does this really mean for your clients? Well, let's say in your program you decided that you wanted to maybe introduce jumping, or lunging, or squatting. And maybe you chose that because we knew that if we wanted to increase the intensity, I should incorporate something that would have the ground involved. So I could do a seated bench press, or I could do a push-up. Now as soon as I do a push-up, maybe I'm not lifting all my body weight, but there's a certain benefit to having the ground pushing back against you. And that is we're upregulating and increasing the times velocity. Power is the product of force times velocity. But when an object wants to move in its direction, it will continue in that direction until an external force is made on it. Therefore, the faster we move a ball from side to side, you can see how I have to shift my weight, load into that ground, and change the direction of that ball. Okay? If I stop it, we've lost momentum. Momentum's not necessarily a factor any longer. What is a factor is inertia. And inertia is known as an object's resistance to change. Because of Newton's first law, knowing that that object is going to want to continue in that direction, it's just going to keep on going until we actually stop it. So if I wanted to do an exercise using inertia, I could go into a prone position. So we got ground reaction force, we got some momentum, but we also have inertia. So I could stop it in a different direction, I could move it in a different direction, right? And every time I do that, that's going to change the line of stress going through my body. No different than if I was pushing here, or pushing here, or rowing here, or rowing here. The action and the way in which we move it, and the products that we're going to discuss on Skype, really just talks about how momentum is one force, acceleration is part of force, right? The mass is part of force, as we know force is mass times acceleration. But if we use the concept of ground reaction force, momentum, inertia, ground reaction force, all these different factors, we can get a better understanding of how much force is going through our client's body. So that will help you determine whether you're going to progress an exercise or regress an exercise. And these are all important things to consider. So until I talk to you guys over the next time, maybe play around with that a little bit. And hope you guys have a great weekend. We'll talk to you on Monday.